The autumn morning in Denver was crisp and clear, the kind of day when the Rocky Mountains seemed close enough to touch from downtown. Emma had woken up that morning with her stomach in knots, a sensation that had become all too familiar over the past 6 months. Today was the day. Today, she would have to stand in front of a room full of strangers and tell them about the worst night of her life. The night that had fractured her childhood into a before and after. Her grandmother had braided Emma's long dark hair with extra care, perhaps trying to instill confidence through the simple ritual they'd shared since Emma was 5 years old. Hands trembled slightly as she wove the strands together. She was nervous too, though she tried to hide it behind a brave smile. They sat together in the courthouse lobby on a wooden bench, waiting to be called. Emma wore a pale blue dress that made her look even smaller than her 9 years. Buddy, her golden retriever service dog, rested his massive head on her lap, his warm brown eyes watching the crowd of people flowing through the halls. The animal had been a gift from the Victim Advocacy Office, a dog specially trained to recognize anxiety and provide comfort through presence alone. Buddy was 3 years old, golden-furred and muscular, yet somehow gentle enough that children instinctively trusted him. He'd been with Emma every day since the incident, his existence a constant reminder that some adults did understand what she'd been through. His presence made things fractionally more bearable, like holding your favorite toy during a thunderstorm. "Remember," whispered, squeezing Emma's shoulder, "you just tell the truth. That's all anyone can ask of you." Emma nodded, though her throat felt tight. The truth. It seemed like such a simple thing, but nothing had felt simple since that night 6 months ago. The night itself had started ordinarily enough. Emma and her grandmother had been in the kitchen making empanadas, hands moving with practiced efficiency as she folded the pastry dough. Emma had been telling her about a math test, about how she'd finally understood fractions. Normal, peaceful, the kind of evening that bookends a typical childhood. Then came the sound, a window shattering in the living room, the violent crack of glass and the screech of metal as someone forced open the security bars. Had grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her into the pantry, locking the door behind them. They crouched in the darkness, surrounded by cans of beans and jars of rice, while a man's voice echoed through the house, calling out threats and slurs. Emma had held her breath, literally held it, for what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes. Buddy, who had been with Emma since the beginning of that summer, had pressed against her leg, his body a steady anchor in the chaos. The intruder had ransacked the house, stolen's late husband's watch and some jewelry, and assaulted her grandmother as she emerged from the pantry when police sirens wailed in the distance. The man had fled, but the damage was done. Not just the broken window or the stolen items, but something deeper, something that lived inside Emma's chest now, a weight that never fully lifted. That was why they were here today. The defense attorney, Frank, had arrived early and was standing near the courtroom entrance, reviewing his notes with the casual confidence of a man who'd won hundreds of cases. He was tall, probably in his late 40s, with expensive shoes and the kind of haircut that cost more than Emma's entire wardrobe. When he saw Emma and Buddy sitting on the bench, a faint smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that made Emma's skin crawl. He knew, somehow he just knew, that she was his competition today, and he already believed he would destroy her. The court clerk called their names at 9:47, squeezed Emma's hand one final time. Buddy stood with them, his leash held loosely in Emma's grip. As they walked toward the courtroom doors, Emma felt like she was walking into a coliseum where lions waited to devour her. The gallery was packed, reporters with notepads, curious spectators, investigators, police officers, and victim advocates. The energy felt hostile, or at least indifferent, like she was insignificant, just another small voice in a system designed by adults for adults. Judge sat elevated on her bench, her gray hair pulled back severely, her expression professional and unreadable. She was a woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for 23 years. She'd seen cases come and go, and she developed a certain immunity to emotional appeals. What mattered to her was evidence, procedure, and the law. Emma was simply a witness, a child witness, which made her testimony less reliable according to every legal precedent. The prosecutor, Maria, stood and smiled warmly at Emma, but even that smile seemed laden with the weight of expectation. Maria was 38, brilliant, and had dedicated her career to victims. She'd personally vouched for Buddy's presence in the courtroom, fighting with for 30 minutes in chambers before the judge agreed to allow the service dog. Maria believed in Emma's testimony implicitly, but she was also a realist. She knew that would attack, and she knew that juries often didn't trust children. The jury, 12 men and women of varying ages, sat in their box, most of them looking mildly interested but fundamentally skeptical. As the bailiff prepared to swear Emma in, the gallery erupted in barely suppressed snickers. A 9-year-old girl against a professional defense attorney who'd made his career destroying testimony. The courtroom's collective sentiment seemed to be that this was almost unfair, but unfair to whom was the real question. Emma placed her hand on the Bible. The bailiff asked her to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Emma's voice was barely audible when she said, "I do." Buddy settled beneath the witness stand, his body touching Emma's feet. The courtroom fell silent, waiting. Maria stood and approached with her opening question, and Emma understood in that moment that everything was about to change. She was about to tell her story to a room full of strangers, many of whom had already decided she wasn't credible simply because of her age. The weight of that injustice, that her words had to battle against prejudice before they could even be heard, settled on her shoulders. But she would speak. She had to speak, because her grandmother had taught her that truth was the most powerful weapon anyone possessed, and even a 9-year-old girl could wield it. Maria approached the witness stand with deliberate gentleness, her movements slow and measured, as if she were approaching a frightened animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. She smiled warmly at Emma, and her first question was innocuous, designed to help the girl settle into her voice and find her confidence. "Can you tell the court your full name, please?" Emma replied, her voice small but surprisingly clear. She'd been practicing this in her mind for weeks, answering questions, telling the story, reliving that night over and over again in preparation for this moment. "And how old are you, Emma?" "9, I'll be 10 in March." The questions continued, gentle and easy. Where did she live? With her grandmother, Martinez. Did she go to school? Yes, Horace Elementary in 4th grade. What were her favorite subjects? Math and reading. With each answer, Emma felt her shoulders relax fractionally. Buddy, sensing the shift in her emotional state, shifted his position slightly, pressing more firmly against her feet, a gesture of steady support. Maria glanced at the jury, noting that several members were beginning to regard Emma with something approaching sympathy rather than skepticism. The prosecutor understood that building rapport was essential. You couldn't simply thrust a traumatized child into the witness stand and expect her to function. She needed to warm up, to remember that her voice mattered, that adults were listening. "Emma, I want to ask you about the evening of May 15th of this year. Do you remember that night?" Emma's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. Her palms had begun to sweat. "Yes," she whispered. "I know this is difficult," Maria said softly, "but I need you to tell the court in your own words what happened that evening. Take your time. There's no rush." Emma took a deep breath. Buddy pressed against her feet again, as if reminding her that he was there, that she wasn't alone in this moment despite being surrounded by strangers in dark suits and judicial robes. She began to speak, and as she did, something remarkable happened. Her fear transformed into focus. The memories, which she'd feared would scatter and disappear when she needed them, came flooding back with crystalline clarity. "Grandma and I were making empanadas in the kitchen," Emma began, her voice growing steadier. "We were going to have them for dinner. Grandma was teaching me how to fold them the right way, the way her mother had taught her. I was telling her about a math test about fractions. I'd gotten an A on it." Several jurors smiled involuntarily. This small detail, A child proud of an academic achievement made her suddenly real to them, not just a victim or a witness, but an actual child with actual life. Then we heard the window break. It was really loud. Grandma grabbed my hand really fast and she pulled me into the pantry. She locked the door behind us. We were standing in the dark and I could hear him moving around the house. "When you say him, who do you mean?" Maria asked gently. Emma pointed toward the defendant, a man named who sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, his expression carefully neutral. "That man. He was in our house." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge banged her gavel once sharply. "I could hear his voice," Emma continued. "He was saying bad words. He was angry. He kept calling for people, saying things like he knew someone was home. His voice was really loud and mean. I was scared. I held Buddy really tight and he didn't make any sound. He just stayed quiet with me." "Can you describe what you heard him doing?" Emma closed her eyes, mentally reconstructing the soundscape of that terrifying evening. "He was in the living room first. I could hear things falling like he was throwing stuff around. Then he went to Grandma's bedroom. I heard drawers opening. He was looking for things to steal. Then he came toward the kitchen, toward the pantry, and my heart was beating so fast I thought it was going to jump out of my chest." The courtroom was silent now, completely silent. Every person present was transported to that pantry, living the terror through Emma's words. "I remember his footsteps," Emma said, her eyes still closed. "They were heavy. He had on boots, black boots with worn-down heels. I could hear the worn part making a scraping sound on the kitchen tile. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. He stopped right outside the pantry door. I thought he was going to open it, I thought." Her voice caught slightly, and she had to pause to collect herself. "I thought something really bad was going to happen." Maria waited patiently, allowing Emma the space to breathe, to gather her composure. Several jurors were leaning forward now, completely engaged. "But Grandma had locked the door and he didn't try to open it. He kept moving. I heard the police sirens after a few minutes. They were getting closer and closer. And then he ran. I could hear him running toward the back of the house, and then I heard the back door slam open and glass breaking again." "When you first heard the window break, when the intruder entered the house, what could you see?" "Nothing at first," Emma said. "We were in the kitchen and the light was on. But then Grandma pulled me into the pantry and it was dark in there. But the door has a small space under it and there was light coming from the hallway. When he was in the living room, I could see his shadow moving under the door." "Could you see what he was wearing?" Emma opened her eyes and looked directly at. He had on a red jacket. It was a dark red, like maroon. And there was a rip on the left side near his arm. The fabric was torn and I could see black underneath. Shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. His attorney made a note on his legal pad, but his confident expression had dimmed slightly. "The red jacket you're describing, have you seen anything like it since that night?" "Yes," Emma said. "When the police brought him out, I was in Grandma's bedroom and I saw him through the window. He had on the same red jacket with the same tier." "Emma, you mentioned his boots. Can you describe them in more detail?" "They were black work boots, like construction boots. Both heels were worn down, but the right heel was more worn than the left. They made a clicking sound when he walked on the tile, especially the right one. It clicked differently than the left one." Maria paused, letting the detail sink in. She'd coached Emma on the importance of specific, observable details, the things that couldn't be suggested, that could only come from direct observation. "How long do you think the intruder was in your house, Emma?" Emma was quiet for a moment, visualizing the timeline. "Maybe 10 minutes, from when the window broke to when the police sirens scared him away. It felt like longer because I was scared, but I think it was about 10 minutes." "Did you recognize his voice from anywhere?" "Yes," Emma said firmly. "Grandma and I get the neighborhood watch emails. There was a man whose picture and description were sent around a few weeks before. He had robbed houses on our street. When I heard this man's voice, it sounded like the man from the emails. I recognized his laugh. It was mean. Maria allowed the testimony to breathe for a moment before asking her final question. Emma, are you certain it was this man, the one sitting right there, who was in your house that night? Emma looked directly at, yes, I'm absolutely sure. As Emma finished speaking, she realized her hands had stopped shaking. Buddy had remained perfectly calm throughout her entire testimony, his presence a constant anchor. Several jurors were nodding thoughtfully, their initial skepticism replaced by something that looked remarkably like belief. Maria smiled at Emma. Thank you for your courage, Emma. I know that was difficult, but you did beautifully. Then she stepped back and returned to her seat, knowing that the hardest part was about to begin. Frank stood, rolling up his sleeves, ready to attack. Frank stood with the deliberate slowness of a predator rising to its feet. His expensive shoes clicked against the courtroom floor as he approached the witness stand, and Emma felt her stomach clench. This was a different energy entirely from Maria's gentle questioning. Was a man in his prime, a man whose entire career had been built on his ability to dismantle testimony, to plant seeds of doubt in jurors' minds, to make the truth seem malleable and unreliable. He'd successfully defended 47 cases over his 15-year career, and his reputation preceded him like a dark shadow. He didn't start with aggression. Instead, he began with something almost worse, friendly skepticism, the tone of a man trying to help Emma understand why her memory might be playing tricks on her. Emma, that was a very detailed account you just gave, began, his voice warm and almost complimentary. Very thorough. I'm sure you've thought about that night many times since it happened, haven't you? Yes, Emma replied cautiously. In fact, I would imagine you've talked about it with your grandmother, with the police, with victim advocates, perhaps with teachers and counselors. Is that correct? Emma hesitated. Where was he going with this? Yes, I've talked about it. So you've told this story multiple times. How many times would you estimate, Emma? 20 times, 50 times, more? I don't know exactly, Emma admitted. Smiled. Of course you don't. But the point is, the more times you tell a story, the more it becomes part of your memory, doesn't it? Sometimes, after retelling something many times, we start to include details that we heard from other people, or details we saw on television, or details we imagined. Isn't that possible? But I remember what I saw, Emma said, her voice smaller now. I'm sure you do, said, and his tone was almost sympathetic. But memory is tricky, especially in children. You see, Emma, the human brain, even adult brains, but especially children's brains, they're not like video cameras. They don't simply record what happened. Instead, they interpret, they fill in gaps, they suggest things to themselves. He walked to the jury box, and several jurors turned their heads to follow him. This was his domain. The jury's attention was his to command. Let me ask you something, Emma. You said it was dark in the pantry, correct? Yes, Emma said. In fact, you said it was completely dark in there, and you could only see shadows and light coming from under the door, right? Yes. So the space under the door, how much light would you say came through? Was it a lot of light or just a little light? Emma thought about this. Just a little, a line of light. Turned back to her with an expression that suggested he was about to deliver a crucial point. So we have a 9-year-old child who is terrified, hiding in a dark pantry with only a thin line of light, trying to see someone moving in a lit hallway. And from that thin line of light, you were able to determine the color of his jacket. Yes, because pantries are dark places, aren't they, Emma? You can't really see colors clearly in the dark. The brain tends to fill in what it expects to see based on minimal visual information. But I saw the tear, Emma insisted, her voice growing slightly louder. I saw. You saw a shadow that you interpreted as a tear, corrected gently. There's a difference. When you're frightened and seeing shadows through a thin line of light, your brain tries to make sense of the information. It sees a line or a shadow and fills in the rest. It's not lying, Emma. It's just how brains work. He returned to the defense table and picked up a document. Now, Emma, you mentioned that this man, the intruder, sounded like someone from a neighborhood watch email. But you haven't actually read that email again since that night, have you? You're relying on your memory of what was in that email, which you received several weeks before the incident. That's 3 or 4 weeks, possibly longer, between reading the email and the night of the break-in. Isn't that correct? I think so, Emma said quietly. And in those 3 or 4 weeks, you could have seen other people, heard other voices, seen other images. Your brain has been exposed to a lot of stimuli. Isn't it possible that you're conflating different memories? That the voice you remember might actually be a combination of the email description and someone else you heard during those intervening weeks? Emma's confidence was visibly shaken. She looked toward her grandmother in the gallery, but was instructed not to react, not to show emotion that might influence the jury. I know what I heard, Emma said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Pressed forward. I'm sure you do from your perspective, but memory is subjective, Emma. Let me ask you this. How long have you had Buddy? The sudden change of direction caught Emma off guard. Since the beginning of June. And the incident was May 15th. So Buddy wasn't even with you during the incident, was he? No, but... So your memories of that night, they formed before Buddy came into your life. Yet here you are today, a few months later, and Buddy has been with you every day since then. It's possible that you're incorporating Buddy into your memories of that night, isn't it? That your brain is revising the memory to include him, even though he wasn't there. I remember him being there, Emma said weakly, but she sounded uncertain now. You remember it now, agreed. After spending 3 months with him. But is that a true memory, or is that your brain filling in gaps and creating a narrative that feels comforting? Maria stood. Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already that Buddy was present that evening. Counsel is asking her to second-guess her own memory based on speculative psychological theories. Judge nodded. Sustained. Mister, please ask questions rather than make arguments. Didn't seem bothered by the interruption. He'd already accomplished what he needed, planted doubt. He'd suggested that Emma's memory was unreliable, that her brain was filling in details, that she was confusing timelines and incorporating elements into her recollection that hadn't actually occurred. He'd done it all with a tone of concern, as if he were helping her understand her own mind better. Emma, you mentioned the boots had worn heels. Have you seen other people wearing boots with worn heels since that night? I don't think so, Emma said. You don't think so? That seems like something you would remember if you'd seen another person with worn boot heels, wouldn't you? But you can't even be certain you haven't. That's how specific this detail is. You might have seen it dozens of times and not registered it consciously. So how can you be certain that the worn heels you remember are actually from the intruder and not from some other person you've seen? The gallery was shifting now. The initial sympathy for Emma seemed to be eroding, replaced by the subtle skepticism that had carefully cultivated. Jurors exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering their initial assessment. One older woman was shaking her head slightly, as if she just realized something important. Your grandmother was assaulted, correct? Asked, changing direction again. Yes, Emma said quietly. That must have been traumatic for you. Witnessing violence against your grandmother would create significant emotional disturbance in a child, wouldn't it? And trauma affects memory. It clouds judgment. It causes people to see things that aren't there and to miss things that are. But I remember what happened, Emma repeated. But she sounded like a broken record now, her conviction worn down by relentless questioning. I'm sure you do, said, and he said it with such sympathy that it almost seemed like he believed her. But what you remember might not be exactly what happened. And in a criminal case, Emma, exactness matters. The details matter. And when those details come from a traumatized 9-year-old child who's been recounting the story dozens of times and has had it reinforced by adults and by her own coping mechanisms, well, that creates reasonable doubt. And in this country, reasonable doubt means the defendant goes free. He returned to his seat, and there was a quality of satisfaction in his movement. He'd done his job. He transformed Emma from a credible witness into a symbol of everything that was problematic about child testimony. The suggestibility, the unreliability, the way trauma and time could distort memory into something that looked like truth but might be anything but. Emma sat in the witness stand, diminished, her hands trembling again. Buddy pressed against her feet, trying to provide comfort, but even the dog's presence couldn't undo the psychological demolition that had just occurred. The lunch break felt like a funeral. Maria sat alone in the prosecution's office on the third floor, her untouched sandwich growing stale on her desk. She replayed cross-examination over and over in her mind, each replay more painful than the last. She'd anticipated that he would attack Emma's credibility. She'd prepared Emma as well as any child could be prepared. But she hadn't fully anticipated how effectively would weaponize basic psychological principles, how he would take the natural vulnerabilities of childhood memory and transform them into evidence of unreliability. The problem was that he wasn't entirely wrong. Childhood memory was suggestible. Trauma did affect recollection. Time and repeated storytelling did create the potential for contamination of memory. Had simply taken these truths and extrapolated them into reasonable doubt, which was exactly his job as a defense attorney. And he'd done it brilliantly, with a tone of such concern and sympathy that even Maria had found herself wondering whether Emma's memories were as reliable as she'd believed. In the gallery, reporters were already typing. The local news anchor, a woman named Jennifer, was on her phone with her producer. "The prosecution's case is falling apart," Maria overheard as she passed through the hallway. "A skilled defense attorney just dismantled a child witness in about 45 minutes. This case is looking less and less certain." Social media was exploding with commentary. Justice for was trending, but so was child memory unreliable and child witnesses are problematic. The narrative was shifting in real time, the sympathy that had briefly existed for Emma being replaced by skepticism about whether a 9-year-old's testimony could ever be trusted in a criminal case. Sat in the gallery, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She'd listened to her granddaughter's testimony that morning with pride, marveling at Emma's courage. But then she'd watched systematically dismantle it, watched the jurors' faces shift from belief to doubt, and she felt something inside her break. She'd been hoping that justice would be straightforward, that the truth would simply speak for itself. Instead, she was witnessing the triumph of rhetoric over reality. Emma was in a separate room with the victim advocate, a kind woman named Sarah who was trying to help the girl process what had happened. Emma was devastated. She'd told the truth, she knew she had, yet she'd been made to doubt herself. That was a real gift, the ability to make truth seem questionable. "Did I do something wrong?" Emma asked Sarah, her voice small and broken. "No, sweetheart," Sarah assured her, putting an arm around the girl's shoulders. "You did everything right. Adults are just complicated sometimes." When court reconvened at 1 o'clock, the prosecution called its next witness. Officer James, who had responded to the 911 call, was solid, professional, and experienced. He about arriving at its house, finding evidence of forced entry, discovering fleeing through the backyard. But when cross-examined him, the attorney found opportunities to raise questions about the timeline, about the investigative procedures, about whether all proper protocols had been followed. "Officer, when you arrived at the scene, how many minutes had elapsed since the 911 call?" "Approximately 8 minutes," replied. 8 minutes is plenty of time for someone to change clothes, to remove identifying clothing, to alter a crime scene in meaningful ways, isn't it? Potentially, yes. So the defendant could have been wearing completely different clothing when you arrived than what he was wearing during the incident. It's possible, admitted. Smiled possible, that was all he needed. Next, describing the assault, the terror she felt, the violation of having her home invaded. Her testimony was raw and emotional, and several jurors showed compassion, but was gentle with her, almost kind, which somehow made his questions even more devastating. Ms. Martinez, I'm deeply sorry for what happened to you. I can see this has been tremendously difficult. But I need to ask you, during the assault, were you paying attention to details about what the assailant was wearing? I was trying to survive, said her voice shaking. Of course you were. Your body and mind were focused on the immediate threat. The brain, under extreme trauma, doesn't necessarily encode peripheral details like clothing. Isn't that true? I suppose so, said quietly. And Emma witnessed your assault. She heard violence, she heard you in danger. Isn't it possible that her memory of details is clouded not just by her own fear, but by the secondary trauma of witnessing harm come to her grandmother? His eyes welled with tears. She couldn't answer. By mid-afternoon, Maria could feel the courtroom's energy shifting against her. The jurors who had leaned forward with interest during Emma's testimony were now leaning back in their chairs, their expressions thoughtful in a way that suggested they were constructing doubt rather than building certainty. One juror, a man in his 60s who worked in construction, was actually shaking his head slightly, as if disagreeing with the prosecution's narrative. Judge's expression remained neutral, but Maria had tried enough cases before this judge to recognize the signs of concern. Believed in procedure, in following the law, in ensuring that trials were conducted fairly. If she began to suspect that the prosecution was resting its case on the unreliable memory of a traumatized child, she would be inclined toward leniency in her jury instructions, toward emphasizing the importance of corroborating evidence, toward highlighting the weaknesses in the prosecution's case. Sat at the defense table with a subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was watching his own conviction dissolve before his eyes. His attorney had done more than raise reasonable doubt, had suggested that the prosecution's entire case was built on the quicksand of a child's unreliable memory. The investigator who'd been assigned to the case, Detective Maria Santos, briefly but couldn't provide the smoking gun that Maria desperately needed. There was physical evidence, fingerprints that would take weeks to process, trace evidence that was inconclusive. There was nothing immediate, nothing that could override the damage had done to Emma's credibility. As the day wore on and the prosecution presented its remaining witnesses, the narrative continued to erode. Maria watched it happen like witnessing a building collapse in slow motion, each piece of evidence falling into place in a way that actually weakened rather than strengthened her case. The timeline seemed inconsistent. The evidence seemed circumstantial. And hanging over everything was the now questionable testimony of a 9-year-old girl whose memory had been systematically dismantled by a skilled attorney. During the afternoon break, Maria stood in the hallway outside the courtroom and made a phone call to her supervisor, reviewing the case. "I think we might lose this," she said quietly, the admission painful. "We're not done yet," her supervisor replied. "You have closing argument to look forward to, and more importantly, you haven't presented everything yet." But Maria wasn't sure that was true. She felt like she'd already played her strongest card, Emma's testimony, and it had been turned against her. In the gallery, Jennifer was already drafting her story. Prosecution's case against accused home invader crumbles under defense attorney's skillful cross-examination of child witness. The narrative was forming, and it wasn't favorable to the people seeking justice. Held Emma's hand as they waited in the hallway, both of them devastated. They'd told the truth, they'd done everything right, and somehow it still might not be enough. Emma leaned against her grandmother, exhausted and heartbroken, wondering if justice was just a word adults used when they couldn't actually deliver it. Walked past them with his client, not even bothering to hide his confidence. Would likely go free. The system had worked, just not in the way it was supposed to. As sunset painted the Denver sky in shades of orange and purple, the courthouse seemed to glow with the light of injustice, and Maria faced the very real possibility that a violent criminal would walk free because a child's memory had been deemed unreliable. Maria hadn't slept the night before. She sat in her home office, surrounded by case files and legal precedents, her mind racing through possibilities. She'd spent her entire career fighting for victims, and she wasn't about to watch a violent predator walk free because of a legal technicality dressed up as psychology. That's when the idea had come to her, a desperate, unconventional idea born from her late-night conversation with. Had called her around midnight, her voice hoarse from crying. They'd talked for over an hour, and during that conversation, had mentioned something that Maria had almost missed. Emma's grandmother had worked as a therapist for 30 years before retirement. She specialized in trauma recovery in children, had taught Emma a grounding technique, a ritualistic behavior anchored to a specific command that only Emma knew. It was a way for the child to distinguish between real memories and suggested ones, between truth and contamination. It's psychological, had explained. When Emma whispers the command to Buddy, it's like pressing a reset button on her confidence. She's demonstrating that she understands the difference between actual memory and false suggestion. A child who could be easily manipulated wouldn't have this kind of awareness. Maria had listened carefully, her legal mind working through the implications. What was describing was evidence of Emma's intellectual sophistication, her ability to critically examine her own memory, her understanding of the difference between truth and falsehood. It was exactly what had said children couldn't do, and Emma had been doing it all along. She'd called Judge at home that evening, knowing the judge would be annoyed, but understanding that Maria wouldn't call unless it was important. She'd explained the situation carefully, making the legal argument for why this demonstration could be admitted into evidence. Judge had been skeptical initially. This sounded like something out of a television show, not a real courtroom. Your Honor, it's not about the dog being magical or having any special ability to detect lies, Maria had argued. It's about demonstrating Emma's capability, her ability to think about her own thinking. It proves she's not a suggestible child prone to false memories. It proves she understands the distinction between memory and contamination. After 15 minutes of debate, Judge had agreed to allow it, but only if the defense attorney wasn't informed beforehand. If knows what's coming, he'll find grounds to exclude it, the judge had said. We need the element of surprise to protect the record. Now, as Maria sat in the courtroom on the morning of redirect examination, her heart was pounding. She'd coordinated everything with Emma the night before, with help. Emma understood what was going to happen. She'd practiced the command with Buddy multiple times. The dog's trainer had confirmed that the behavior was solid, reliable, and would perform consistently. But there was a risk. If this didn't work, if Buddy didn't respond as trained, or if the jury saw it as a cheap theatrical trick rather than meaningful evidence, Maria's entire case would be further damaged, would crucify her for attempting to manipulate the jury through theatrics. But doing nothing meant letting a violent criminal walk free, and Maria had never been good at accepting that kind of injustice. Sat in the gallery, her hands clasped together so tightly they trembled. Emma had told her the night before what was going to happen. "Grandma, I'm scared it won't work," Emma had admitted. "It will work," had assured her, "because you believe in the truth and the truth is powerful." The morning session had been brutal. Had called his own expert, a child psychologist who that children's memories were notoriously unreliable, that they were susceptible to suggestion, that a 9-year-old's recollection of events 6 months past could easily be contaminated by repeated and adult reinforcement. The expert was credible, well-credentialed, and devastating. Maria had cross-examined him briefly, but she could feel the jurors agreeing with his testimony. The narrative had, Emma was not a reliable witness. Then came redirect examination. Maria stood and approached Emma with a calm she didn't entirely feel. Emma, I want to ask you some questions that might seem a little unusual, but I need you to answer honestly. Have you and Buddy spent a lot of time together since that night in May? Emma nodded. Yes, he's with me almost all day. And during that time, has your grandmother taught you anything special? Anything that helps you understand your own memory? Emma's eyes flickered toward her grandmother. This was the moment where everything could fall apart if Emma lost her nerve. Yes, Emma said softly. Grandma taught me something. She said it would help me know when I was telling the absolute truth versus when I might be confused or remembering something wrong. The courtroom went silent. Several jurors leaned forward. His relaxed posture stiffened slightly. Can you explain what your grandmother taught you? Maria asked gently. She taught me a command, a word that I whisper to Buddy. She said that when I tell the complete truth, Buddy would stay calm and strong with me. But if I was confused or if I was remembering something that wasn't real, we would practice together first, and Buddy would help me understand the difference. So this command is like a way for you to check your own memory. Yes, Emma said, it's like I'm making sure I'm telling the truth. Was on his feet. Your Honor, I object. This is highly irregular. This sounds like the witness is describing some sort of magical thinking or... Not magic, Maria interrupted. Metacognition. Your Honor, I'd like to demonstrate that Emma possesses a level of self-awareness about her own cognitive processes that indicates she's far more sophisticated in her thinking than the defense's expert suggested. This goes directly to her credibility. Judge considered this. She'd known this moment was coming, had prepared for it, had decided in advance what she would allow. The objection is overruled. Proceed, Ms. Sat back down, his jaw clenched. He sensed something was about to happen that he hadn't anticipated, and a skilled attorney never liked surprises. Emma, Maria said, I want you to whisper that command to Buddy right now, right here in court. Can you do that? Emma took a deep breath. She leaned down toward Buddy, who lifted his head attentively. She brought her mouth close to his ear and whispered, so quietly that no one in the courtroom could hear the actual words. Her lips moved silently, the command inaudible to everyone except the dog. For a moment, nothing happened. Maria's heart stopped. She'd made a terrible mistake, she thought. The dog wouldn't perform or would perform the wrong behavior or... Then Buddy moved. The dog stood with fluid grace and walked directly to the witness box railing. He placed his massive paw on the wooden barrier and turned his gaze toward Frank. Not toward the judge, not toward the jury, not toward anyone else. Directly toward the defense attorney who had systematically dismantled Emma's credibility. The dog's eyes locked with his and held them. It was a trained behavior, a command Emma had given, but the timing and the apparent intentionality were overwhelming. Several jurors gasped. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers. Judge banged her gavel once. Order, order in the courtroom. Buddy held his position for 5 more seconds, an eternity in courtroom time, before Emma whispered another command. The dog his paw from the railing and returned to her side, laying his head on her foot in a gesture of profound protection and loyalty. The gallery was in chaos. Reporters were typing frantically. The news anchor was making notes with shaking hands. The jury was staring at Emma with expressions that had completely transformed. Where there had been doubt, there was now fascination, respect, wonder. Stood, his face flushed. This is a circus. This is manipulation of the jury. Sit down, mister, Judge said coldly. You'll have your chance to argue. But the damage was done, or rather, the healing had begun. The demonstration had accomplished exactly what Maria had hoped for. It had shown that Emma was not a suggestible child prone to false memories. Instead, she was intelligent, sophisticated, and capable of understanding the difference between truth and contamination. She was capable of thinking about her own thinking. Emma sat in the witness stand, no longer diminished. Buddy remained at her feet, and for the first time since cross-examination began, Emma looked like what she actually was. Not a frightened, confused child, but a brave young girl who understood the power and importance of truth. Was crying in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. She'd known what was coming, but seeing it happen, watching her granddaughter's credibility restored, watching the jury's expressions shift from skepticism to belief, it was overwhelming. The courtroom had shifted. The narrative had turned. The girl who had been mocked and doubted was now seen as someone remarkable, someone who had not only survived trauma, but who understood her own mind well enough to verify her memories, to distinguish truth from suggestion, to demonstrate her own intellectual integrity. And it had taken a dog to show what words alone could not accomplish. The silence that followed Buddy's return to Emma's side was deafening. It was the kind of silence that occurs when something fundamental has shifted, when the invisible scaffolding supporting one narrative has suddenly collapsed, and people are scrambling to build a new framework for understanding what they just witnessed. Judge sat back in her elevated chair, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes betrayed a hint of satisfaction. She'd taken a calculated risk by allowing this demonstration, and it had paid off in ways that transcended courtroom procedure. She'd witnessed something that couldn't be taught in law school, the moment when evidence became not just information, but transformation. The jury was staring at Emma with completely different eyes now. The older woman who had been shaking her head in skepticism had tears in her eyes. The construction worker who had seemed dismissive was leaning forward with intense focus. A younger juror, a woman in her 30s, was looking at Emma with an expression of profound respect, as if seeing a child in an entirely new light. Frank remained standing, his earlier confidence shattered like glass. He'd anticipated many things during his career, emotional outbursts from witnesses, surprise evidence, legal maneuvering, but he hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't anticipated that a defense strategy built on discrediting a child would backfire so spectacularly. The dog's behavior, the apparent intentionality of it, the way it seemed to respond to the truth of Emma's testimony, it had accomplished something that raw testimony never could. It had made Emma's credibility visceral and emotional rather than merely verbal and intellectual. Maria felt the energy shift like a physical force. Her entire body seemed to lighten, as if a weight she'd been carrying since devastating cross-examination had suddenly been lifted. But she didn't allow herself to celebrate yet. There was still a trial to win, and was far too skilled to accept this defeat without fighting back. She approached Emma slowly, deliberately, her movements measured to give the jury time to process what they'd just witnessed. "Emma," she said softly, "can you explain to the court what that command means? What is the word you whispered to Buddy?" "I can't say it out loud," Emma replied, her voice strong and clear now, completely different from the small, uncertain voice that had wavered under assault. "Grandma said if I say the command out loud, it loses its power. It only works when it's whispered." "Why is that?" Maria asked, though she already knew the answer from her conversations with. "Because it's a special thing between me and Buddy," Emma explained. "It's like a secret code. When I whisper it, I'm reminding myself to be absolutely honest. I'm telling myself that this is the moment to say only what I know for certain, not what I think I might remember, not what someone told me happened. Just the truth." A juror, the woman in the back row who worked as a therapist, was nodding slowly, recognizing the psychological principle at work. This was sophisticated emotional regulation, the kind of awareness that proved Emma had the capability to monitor and verify her own memories. "And when you whispered that command to Buddy today, in this courtroom, did you feel confident about the testimony you've given?" "Yes," Emma said. "I was telling the truth about that night. Every detail I told was real, I'm certain." Was on his feet again, but before he could object, Judge held up her hand. Mister, I'll hear your objection in a moment. Ms., any other questions on redirect? Maria smiled. No, Your Honor, I think the witness has been quite clear. She returned to her seat and approached the witness stand with an entirely different energy now. His earlier confident swagger was gone, replaced by something more desperate. He was a skilled attorney trying to salvage a case that had just been significantly damaged by a demonstration he hadn't seen coming. Emma, he began, his voice no longer warm and sympathetic but strained. You're telling us that a dog can determine whether you're telling the truth. No, Emma said, and there was a quality of mature composure in her voice that hadn't been there before. The dog doesn't determine anything. I determine whether I'm telling the truth. The dog is just a helper. Like my grandma said, it's like pressing a button to remind myself to be honest. But that's just a psychological trick, isn't it? A way to make yourself feel more confident about memories that might not be accurate. It's not a trick, Emma said firmly. It's a way to make sure I'm not confusing what I really remember with what people told me or what I imagined. Grandma taught me that our brains can do that. They can mix things up. So the command helps me separate real memories from confused ones. This was the moment when Emma's testimony transformed from child account into something far more credible. She was demonstrating not but awareness. She understood the psychological mechanisms of memory formation. She understood her own cognitive vulnerabilities and had developed a system to protect against them. This wasn't the testimony of a confused child easily manipulated by adults. This was the testimony of a young person who understood her own mind. Tried a different approach. Isn't it possible that you trained Buddy to perform this behavior regardless of whether you were telling the truth? Isn't it possible that this is all just theater designed to make the jury believe you? No, Emma said, because Grandma knows psychology. She wouldn't teach me something that wasn't real. She wouldn't help me lie. That would be wrong. But couldn't you be lying without your grandmother knowing it? Couldn't you have memorized this behavior with Buddy and trained him to do it no matter what? Emma looked confused by the question. But I'm not lying. And Buddy is a good dog. He wouldn't help me lie even if I tried to teach him to. It was a child's logic, simple and pure, and it was more powerful than any legal argument could construct. The jury was watching the exchange with clear sympathy for Emma. Aggressive questioning was starting to look like bullying, an adult attorney trying to trip up a small girl who'd already proven her credibility. Judge's expression suggested she was nodding every moment of this exchange. If pushed too hard, if he appeared to be attacking a child too aggressively, the jury might develop sympathy bias that would extend beyond Emma to the entire prosecution's case. Seemed to recognize this danger. I have no further questions, he said, retreating to his seat more slowly than he'd approached the witness stand. The courtroom felt transformed. The gallery was buzzing with whispered conversations. The news anchor was writing furiously, but now her notes were about Emma's remarkable composure and sophistication, not about the unreliability of child witnesses. The narrative had shifted so completely that it was almost disorienting. Judge called for another break, and as the bailiff stood and announced all rise, the atmosphere in the courtroom was fundamentally different. The prosecution had regained its footing. Emma had been transformed from a victim of cross-examination into a credible, articulate witness whose testimony couldn't be easily dismissed. Rushed to her granddaughter as soon as they were released from the courtroom, embracing her tightly. You were brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Emma collapsed into her grandmother's arms, the emotional weight of the trial suddenly catching up with her. I was so scared, she whispered. I know, said, stroking her hair, but you were brave. You told the truth and the truth won. In the hallway, Maria was approached by reporters. Ms., that was extraordinary. How did you come up with that demonstration? It wasn't my idea, Maria said graciously. It was Emma and her grandmother who understood that sometimes The best way to prove credibility is to demonstrate self-awareness. Emma understands her own mind better than most adults understand theirs. Stood apart from the media circus, consulting quietly with his client. His confident demeanor had crumbled. The case that had seemed winnable just hours ago now looked significantly more difficult. A jury that had been ready to acquit based on reasonable doubt had just witnessed a child who was anything but unreliable, anything but confused, anything but susceptible to suggestion. As evening fell on Denver, the courthouse seemed to pulse with different energy. A girl had stood up for truth, a dog had demonstrated loyalty, and justice was suddenly looking less like an impossible dream and more like an actual possibility. The trial would continue, closing arguments would follow, but everyone in that courtroom knew that something fundamental had changed. Emma had not just, she had transformed the nature of the case itself. The courtroom was packed on the morning of closing arguments. Word had spread throughout Denver about the remarkable testimony from a 9-year-old girl and her service dog. The local news had run the story multiple times, and social media had exploded with commentary. Emma and Buddy was now trending nationally, overshadowing the usual discourse about criminal justice. The narrative that had seemed inevitable, child witness unreliable, criminal walks free, had been completely overturned. Maria stood before the jury with a confidence that had been absent for days. She was no longer fighting against the tide of skepticism. She was riding a wave of momentum that had been built by Emma's remarkable demonstration of self-awareness. "Ladies and of the jury," Maria began, "this case has been about memory, about truth, and about understanding the difference between what we think we know and what we actually know. The defense has argued extensively about the unreliability of children's memory, and they're right that memory is a complex phenomenon. But what we learned during this trial is that Emma doesn't just have memory, she has metacognition. She understands her own mind. She knows how memory works, and she's developed tools to verify her own recollections." Maria walked slowly before the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "Emma told you specific details about the night of the invasion, a red jacket with a tear on the left side, black boots with worn heels, particularly on the right foot, the intruder's distinctive laugh, his voice that matched the neighborhood watch description. These aren't vague generalities that could apply to any suspect. These are specific, observable details that could only come from someone who was actually there, who was actually paying attention." She paused, letting the silence speak for a moment. And when the defense attacked her credibility, when they suggested her memory was unreliable, Emma didn't crumble. She didn't change her story. She remained consistent. Why? Because she was telling the truth. And we saw proof of that when Emma performed the ritual with Buddy, a ritual designed specifically to help her distinguish between real memories and suggested ones. That's not the behavior of a confused child. That's the behavior of a young person with remarkable self-awareness and integrity. Maria pointed toward. The man sitting at that defense table invaded Martinez's home. He assaulted her. He stole from her. And he believed that he could walk free because a 9-year-old girl's testimony could be dismissed through clever legal maneuvering. But Emma proved that she's not easily dismissed. She's not confused. She's not suggestible. She's credible. She returned to her seat, having said everything that needed to be said. Frank stood for closing argument, but his earlier confidence was entirely gone. He'd been outmaneuvered, and he knew it. The jury was looking at him with skepticism now, where before they'd been looking at the prosecution with doubt. "The defense doesn't dispute that a crime occurred," said, his voice lacking its earlier warmth. "A woman was assaulted, and that's terrible. But terrible crimes don't automatically mean we convict the first suspect. The law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the law recognizes that child witnesses, no matter how sophisticated they seem, are still children. They still have limitations in their ability to accurately perceive and remember events." But even as spoke, the jury seemed unconvinced. He was preaching to people who just watched a child demonstrate remarkable psychological sophistication. His arguments about memory reliability sounded hollow now, like he was arguing against something they'd already moved beyond. The prosecution's case rests almost entirely on the testimony of a 9-year-old child, continued. And yes, we've acknowledged that she seemed confident, that she seemed consistent, but confidence and consistency don't equal accuracy. And as for this ritual with the dog, he paused, searching for a way to undermine it. What we're really seeing is a child who has been trained to perform a behavior, nothing more. A dog responding to a command doesn't prove anything about the reliability of human memory. But his argument fell flat. The jury had seen something in that moment with Buddy that transcended legal argument. They'd seen a child who understood her own mind, who understood the fragility of memory, who had taken steps to protect the integrity of her recollections. That was something couldn't. Judge gave her jury instructions, carefully balancing the law's recognition of the challenges with child testimony against the jury's own observations. You may consider the age of the witness in evaluating her credibility, the judge instructed. However, you should not automatically discount testimony merely because it comes from a child. Each witness must be evaluated on an individual basis, considering their ability to perceive, remember, communicate, and their truthfulness. The jury retired to deliberate at 2:47 p.m. In the hallway, Maria stood with Emma. Emma was exhausted, emotionally drained from days of testimony and cross-examination, but there was a quality of peace about her now. She'd done what she needed to do. She'd told the truth, and she'd done it in a way that couldn't be dismissed. "Whatever happens now, you should be proud," Maria told her. "You showed more courage and integrity than many adults I've worked with." Held her granddaughter close, praying silently for justice. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 45 minutes. It was not a quick verdict, which traditionally favored the defense. A hung jury or acquittal seemed more likely when deliberations extended beyond a few hours. But when the jury returned to the courtroom, their expressions told a different story. They looked determined, unified, serious. Judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," the jury foreman, an elderly man named Robert, no relation to the judge, said. The courtroom fell silent, sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw clenched. "We find the defendant guilty on count 1, assault with a deadly weapon." Gasped, tears streamed down her face. "We find the defendant guilty on count 2, home invasion with intent to commit theft." Emma grabbed her grandmother's hand. "We find the defendant guilty on count 3, aggravated assault." The gallery erupted. Reporters were on their phones immediately, typing their stories in real time. The news would go out within minutes. Jury convicts man in home invasion case despite child witness challenge. 9-year-old girl's remarkable testimony key to conviction. Stood, his face a mask of professional composure, but his shoulders had slumped slightly. He'd lost. His strategy of undermining a child's credibility had backfired catastrophically. Began shouting his innocence, calling the verdict unjust, demanding that his attorney appeal. Judge silenced him with a stern look. As the bailiffs led out of the courtroom, he made eye contact with Emma. There was rage in his eyes, the look of a man who'd been defeated by a child he'd underestimated. Emma held his gaze without flinching, and for a moment, the power dynamic was completely reversed. She was no longer the vulnerable child on the witness stand. She was the girl who had brought a violent predator to justice through nothing more than her commitment to truth. After the jury was dismissed, the judge approached Emma from the bench. "I want to say something for the record," Judge said formally. "In my 23 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed a young person demonstrate the level of integrity and courage that you did this week, miss. Your testimony, your willingness to face difficult questioning, and your remarkable self-awareness were all instrumental in seeing justice served. You should be very proud." Emma looked up at the judge, and for the first time since the trial began, she smiled, A real smile, not forced or anxious but genuine. Embraced her granddaughter as people stood and applauded. It was highly irregular for a courtroom to applaud a verdict, but Judge didn't silence it. She simply sat back in her chair and watched as a community celebrated truth, as justice had finally been served, as a brave young girl was finally recognized for her extraordinary courage. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Maria and Emma. Camera flashes erupted like lightning. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, wanted to hear from the girl who changed everything. Emma, a reporter, called out, "How does it feel to see justice served?" Emma looked at her grandmother, then at Buddy, then back at the reporter. "It feels right," she said simply, "because the truth won." 6 months after his conviction, Emma stood in front of a room full of people she'd never met before. She wasn't in a courtroom this time, but rather in the auditorium of the Denver Children's Center, speaking at a conference dedicated to supporting child witnesses in the criminal justice system. Her grandmother stood nearby, beaming with pride. Buddy, now famous throughout Colorado, lay calmly at Emma's feet, his presence a testament to the journey they'd shared. Emma was no longer the frightened 9-year-old who had entered the county courthouse with trembling hands. She was now 10 years old, her 10th birthday having arrived 2 months after the trial ended. But more importantly, she'd been transformed by her experience. She discovered something about herself, a capacity for courage that she hadn't known she possessed. "When I first had to testify," Emma told the assembled crowd of attorneys, judges, victim advocates, and child psychologists, "I thought the truth would be enough. I thought that if I just told people what happened, they would believe me. But I learned that sometimes telling the truth isn't enough. Sometimes you have to help people understand that you know the difference between truth and confusion. Sometimes you have to prove that you're not just a child making up stories." Judge sat in the audience, listening intently. She'd been invited to speak at the conference as well, and she'd specifically requested that Emma be included as a speaker. This young girl had taught the judge something valuable about credibility, about perception, about the complexity of justice. "My grandmother taught me something important," Emma continued. "She taught me that our brains are really good at trying to be helpful, but sometimes they get confused. They mix up what we really remember with what we think happened or what other people told us happened. So she helped me create a ritual, a way to check my memory, a way to make sure I'm telling the truth. And when I did that ritual in court, I wasn't just proving that I remembered correctly. I was proving that I understood how my own mind works." The audience was transfixed. Here was a child who could articulate something that most adults struggled with: the nature of memory, the importance of metacognition, the power of ritual in anchoring truth. Watched her granddaughter speak, tears streaming down her face. She'd spent her entire career helping people heal from trauma, and now she was watching her granddaughter become a healer in her own way, showing other children that they could survive, that they could speak truth to power, that courage came in many forms. "Emma's case has become something of a landmark," Judge said when it was her turn to speak. "In my courtroom, we're now training victim advocates to work with children on awareness, essentially, teaching them to understand their own memory processes before they testify. We're seeing more child witnesses feeling confident and credible because they understand the mechanisms of their own minds. And we're seeing juries responding to that self-awareness with more credibility than they might have otherwise." The legal community was learning from Emma's example. Law schools began incorporating her case into curriculum about child testimony. Victim advocacy organizations started training programs based on the techniques had developed. Emma had inadvertently revolutionized how child witnesses were supported and presented in criminal trials. Had received a sentence of 15 years with the possibility of parole after serving 12. He was currently incarcerated in a Colorado prison, and his appeals had all been rejected. The evidence against him was solid, not just Emma's testimony, but the fingerprints that had matched his record, the stolen items recovered from his apartment, the DNA evidence from the scene. Emma's testimony had been the catalyst, but it wasn't the only evidence. Justice had been built on a foundation of truth and proper procedure. But the impact of the trial extended far beyond the criminal justice system. Emma became something of a local celebrity, though worked hard to protect her from the worst aspects of fame. Invitations poured in for interviews, for speaking engagements, for participation in documentaries about criminal justice. Carefully selected which opportunities were appropriate, which ones would be genuinely beneficial to Emma's development, and which ones were simply exploitative. 1 year after the verdict, opened the Martinez Family Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting trauma survivors, particularly children, through the criminal justice system. The foundation was headquartered in Denver and was financed primarily through donations that came pouring in after Emma's story went viral. The foundation's mission was to provide victim advocacy services, to train service dogs for trauma survivors, and to develop evidence-based techniques for helping child witnesses maintain credibility and confidence. Buddy became the face of the foundation. His story, a service dog who had helped a child convict a violent criminal, resonated with people across the country. Funding came from individuals and corporations who wanted to support Emma's vision of justice. Within 2 years, the foundation had opened satellite offices in 5 other states. Emma remained closely involved with the foundation's work, even as she continued her education and pursued a relatively normal childhood. She attended the same school, maintained her friendships, and tried to avoid the celebrity trap that could have consumed her. But she also volunteered regularly at the foundation, helping other children who were struggling with the criminal justice system, showing them that they could be brave, that their voices mattered, that they could help bring justice. This therapeutic approach became the foundation's methodology. Victim advocates working for the foundation were trained in helping children develop awareness, in teaching them rituals that would anchor their confidence in their own memories, in supporting them through the process of testimony. The foundation partnered with service dog training organizations to develop programs specifically focused on supporting child witnesses in traumatic cases. The ripple effects extended beyond Colorado. Other states began adopting similar approaches. Judges in California, Texas, New York, and Florida all referenced Emma's case as they reconsidered how they evaluated child testimony. Law review articles were written about the phenomenon where juries became significantly more credible of child witnesses who demonstrated awareness and self-monitoring of their own memories. On the 2nd anniversary of the trial, the Denver courthouse held a small ceremony. Judge, Maria, Emma, and many others gathered to commemorate what had become known locally as the case that changed everything. Maria had been promoted to senior prosecutor and was now supervising a new unit dedicated specifically to cases involving child victims and witnesses. 2 years ago, Maria said during the ceremony, a young girl taught us that children are not simply unreliable witnesses. They can be intelligent, self-aware, and powerful advocates for their own truth. Emma's testimony didn't just convict a dangerous criminal. It fundamentally changed how we approach justice for children. Emma stood beside Buddy, now feeling completely at ease with public speaking, with the attention, with the responsibility that had come with her remarkable journey. She'd learned to channel the trauma she'd experienced into something positive, something that helped others. By the time Emma turned 16, the Martinez Family Foundation had supported over 300 child witnesses through the criminal justice system. 85% of the cases handled by the foundation resulted in guilty verdicts, a conviction rate significantly higher than the national average. The foundation's methodology had been studied in peer-reviewed journals and praised by victims' rights organizations around the world. Emma herself became interested in law and psychology, planning to study both in college. She talked frequently about wanting to become a judge or an attorney who specialized in victims' rights. Buddy, now aging gracefully into his golden years, remained her constant companion, a living symbol of the journey they'd shared together. Often looked back on that terrifying night, the night her home was invaded, the night Emma had hidden in the pantry with Buddy, and felt profound gratitude. What had seemed like the worst moment of her life had become the catalyst for change that extended far beyond her family. She transformed her pain into healing for others. Emma occasionally reflected on her experience with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "I think everything happens for a reason," she once told an interviewer. "What happened to my grandma was terrible, and I'll never be glad that it happened. But I am glad that I could help bring justice, and I'm glad that it helped other kids. If my experience can make things better for children who are going through something similar, then maybe something good can come from something bad." On the 10th anniversary of the trial, Emma, now 19 years old and a freshman at the University of Colorado studying criminal justice and psychology, returned to the Denver courthouse. She stood in the same courtroom looking at the witness stand where she'd found her voice. Buddy, now retired from his official duties due to age, walked beside her slowly, both of them marked by time but carrying the weight of their shared history with dignity. Was still in prison, serving his sentence. Emma bore no hatred for him. Instead, she felt something closer to indifference. He was simply a man who had committed a crime and was paying the consequences. What mattered to her was that justice had been served, that her grandmother had been believed, that other children had been empowered by her example. As Emma left the courthouse that day, walking out into the Denver sunshine with Buddy at her side and her grandmother beside her, she understood that her journey had fundamentally changed her. She'd gone from a traumatized child to an advocate for change. She'd gone from being doubted to being celebrated. Most importantly, she discovered that truth, when coupled with courage and integrity, had the power to transform everything. The girl who had whispered a command to a dog in a courtroom had, in that single moment, changed the trajectory of justice for countless children. And that was a legacy that would endure far longer than any trial verdict, any legal precedent, any newspaper headline. She was Emma, she had told the truth, and the truth had won. The end.